Hello. Okay. So, just to be giving an overview of the visceral nervous system, and which also known as the autonomic, while focusing on the complexity of the sympathetic side of the autonomic nervous system. Um, I first want to just go over briefly the general pathway for sensory and motor neurons when dealing with the spinal cord and how they interact. So just to start off, I have a few structures out here. The first one is the overall spinal cord cross section, which is in this circle over here. Um, as you can see, the back side is the dorsal column. The front side right here is the ventral column. And within this spinal cord cross section, you can see two main fields. One of them is more light, and one of them is more dark. So the light areas typically have all these axons running through them, whereas the darker areas typically have a lot more cell bodies. And I refer specifically to within the spinal cord. So if we zoom in over here, you can see that there's like this little butterfly shape in like towards the middle, okay? And there's like pretty distinctive features about this butterfly shape, which is where the cell bodies are. And um, essentially, you have here what's called the dorsal horn. And then at the bottom, which is this giant bulb-like thing, you have the ventral horn. And what essentially these structures do is you'll notice that the sensory fibers, also known as the dorsal root, which is the afferent neurons, you can always remember the thing called same. So that would be the S would be sensory, M would be motor, A would be afferent, and E would be efferent. And afferent just means going towards the CNS. Efferent means going away from the CNS or the central nervous system to be more specific. Um, yeah, okay. So now coming back to the dorsal horn of the spinal cord, all right, at this cross section. So this dorsal horn over here is going to receive sensory neuron input from the dorsal root, okay? And essentially, there's like this little body over here called the dorsal root ganglion. That's typically found because there are cell bodies there. That's all it really is for our understanding. And essentially, it goes in the dorsal root, does its processing in the central nervous system, and then comes out as the ventral root. So if we see the direction here, so we come out with the spinal nerve, pass through into the vertebrae through the intervertebral foramen. It's kind of like a doorway. With these orange arrows, I'll show you the direction. And essentially cross into the spinal cord, through the dorsal root and then the dorsal horn, come down, and then now you exit the spinal cord through the ventral root and eventually the intervertebral foramen. So that kind of establishes the basics of how this pathway works. And eventually, what this does is both the roots, both dorsal and ventral, will merge into an overall spinal nerve. And that spinal nerve will go wherever. That's a little bit more out of the scope of this thing, for the purposes of this little video and introduction. But the key thing we'll have to keep in mind is not just um, where like where the nerves go in and where they come out, but also where they go towards. So if we look at this blue line over here, all right, this would be what we call one of the rami, or in this case, the dorsal rami. And the purposes of this ramus, which is singular, is essentially going to be um, branching off from the spinal nerve and essentially going to the skin and muscles and blood vessels in the back. So it essentially innervates that area. On the contrast, we have what we call let's see, the ventral rami or ventral ramus for singular. And the significance of that is rather than going towards the posterior side of the back, you're going more towards the superficial back muscles as well as primarily the rest of the upper body. This is typically a lot more like, I'm just gonna put that over here for you guys. Okay. Typically this is a lot more symmetrical in the thorax, a bit more separate in the trunk, and often these may do this thing called, they may merge together and form like these plexes, which essentially go to different parts of the body. Um, both the dorsal ramus up here and the ventral ramus up here per area will essentially come from both the same spinal cord levels. So, for example, we've talked in our classes how um, you'll have different spinal cord levels. These will both come from that same spinal cord level. So, for example, if this were like I don't know, lumbar 4, so L4, all of this entire section, so this spinal cord's cross section, along with these dorsal roots, ventral roots, and then the dorsal rami, ventral rami, those would essentially all be in L4, or whichever one I just said. Um, so the pathway is pretty much very similar. So out you go from the ventral root and then the spinal nerve into both the rami, and they go to their respective regions and innervate those areas. Um, Essentially, because they're part of the same region, or sorry, they come from the same region in the spinal cord, they will eventually go to what is called a dermatome. And that dermatome is essentially spelled like this, it's essentially a layer, a strip of skin where specific nerves are located. So wherever the L4 region is, both on the anterior and posterior side of the anatomy, um, that this specific dermatome will be dedicated towards L4 or whatever might be, and essentially both these rami go to that specific area. So how does this tie into the sympathetic side of the visceral nervous system? So it's a bit more of a complicated pathway. So if we'll scroll down to our original diagram over here, we can see that in this case, this should not be, one second, let me fix this. I'll be back. Okay, I'm back. So kind of like how we just went over the overall pathway within the peripheral nervous system on and how it relates to the spinal cord overall. This is kind of similar, but within the peripheral nervous system, there's the autonomic nervous system and the somatic nervous system. So the somatic nervous system refers to like essentially transporting information from the central nervous system to like the extremities, so like fingers, toes, and the body wall, skin, joints, those kinds of things, and skeletal muscles. Whereas the visceral nervous system or the autonomic nervous system conveys nervous impulses from the central nervous system to like smooth cardiac muscle, glands, and overall involuntary functions. So this is kind of where in the autonomic slash visceral system, the sympathetic nervous system falls under. Okay. So I'll just write that up top. Sympathetic nervous system. And in order to initiate most in any kinds of signals along the spinal cord, this process will begin within the T1 or thoracic 1 all the way until the lumbar 2 region. So all of this here, I'll just circle this, will take place within that region and a little bit along here too, which I'll get into after. So same process as before, however, a few new components. The first is the lateral horn, which is drawn in like green highlights over here, and that's essentially where it contains this little column called the intermediolateral column. And what's significant about this is that it has preganglionic sympathetic cell bodies, which are specific for the sympathetic nervous system. And out of these sympathetic cell bodies, we'll have the ventral root come out, and that will be the preganglionic sympathetic axon. So no synapses have occurred here yet. It's just axons, all right? So let me get a good color. Orange, no, not orange, sorry. Let's do dark green. In that, so same pathway, direction goes as follows. Visceral fibers enter the dorsal horn, information is processed, yada, yada, yada. And then you eventually have axons come from the lateral horn and then out the ventral horn. So information flows here as normal. And now you continue on into the spinal nerve, okay? So arrows come here, but now, as part of the sympathetic nervous system, you are going to exit not any of the rami that we've discussed previously, but rather what's called the white ramus. Okay, so let me just erase that. I'm just gonna just draw a little tube over here where essentially your neural information through the preganglionic fibers goes. All right, so here's like a little um, overall path. Okay. Just for context, this black tube thing here is the spinal nerve. And keep in mind now, all of this takes place within the, uh, let's see, what is it? The thoracic one and the all the way into the lumbar 2 region. And the reason is because the white ramus, which is this little tube here, is made of is coated with myelin sheaths. And that's essentially the little fatty substance on axons, which causes them to speed up a lot faster and provide quicker transmissions due to insulation, nodes around veer, saltatory conduction, that kind of stuff. So we have the white ramus over here, and its white ramus is only found in the sim regions. Okay, just in case I wanted to re-emphasize that. Um, Okay, yeah, moving on. So essentially, the nerve impulses from, let's say, this green color here, goes down into the white ramus and eventually enters what is known as this giant column called the synaptic trunk. And this runs down the entire vertebral column, where essentially information from the sympathetic nervous system can be given to different routes in the body. So there's three overall destinations this can go. And the first one is the overall T1 to L2 region, which is probably the most significant one. So the post preganglion axons will keep going down over here, okay? And eventually we're going to have, let's extend this a little bit more just to give us some space. There we go. Okay. And eventually what's going to happen is it's going to end up synapsing. So let's put a little asterisk over here. And that's when we get our postganglionic. So let's come out of here. And now we're going to be calling this the postganglionic axons. And the reason that this is so important is because of that synapse. So you just want to keep that in mind when talking about the postganglionic synaptics. And essentially what's going to happen is now we're going to be going in this new structure, which is kind of like the ramus, but instead it's called let me make that a bit bigger. It's called a gray ramus. And what this gray ramus does is essentially within the T1 to L2 region, it takes the information back to the spinal nerve associated with that specific vertebrae. So our postganglionic axons keep going back up, all the way back up, and eventually into the spinal nerve. And this spinal nerve will eventually branch out into the previously discussed dorsal rami and the ventral rami, okay? Let me make that a different green just for separating things. Yes, ventral rami. And as we discussed previously, the dorsal rami leads to innervating the back, whereas the ventral rami will lead to innervating the other upper body parts. Okay? So moving on from that, so that is overall pathway 1. So let me circle this in big colors, and this will be oh, wait, sorry. Let me relabel this. I apologize. So this will be the gray ramus right here. Okay, so just a quick review, all right? So far we have everything going with the sympathetic nervous system starting off in the spinal region, T1 to L1. Same thing as before. Their visceral afferent fibers enter the dorsal horn of the spinal cord. Then they go then information is processed, blah, blah, blah. And then your lateral horn, which contains your preganglionic sympathetic cell bodies, will have axons branch off and eventually travel down the ventral root, as these arrows show, out of this little intervertebral, um, what was it? Yeah, intervertebral foramen, and out of that into the spinal nerve, and now the white ramus, right? You keep going down, and then you enter the giant synaptic trunk, also known as the paraventricular ganglion. Either name is fine, apparently. And then eventually, whoops, and then eventually you will synapse right over here and form postganglionic axons. And pathway 1, which let's label that right over here, will travel into the gray ramus, and that gray ramus will travel back into the spinal nerve, and that spinal nerve will branch out into the dorsal and ventral rami respectively, depending on where the information is bound to go. And just to clarify, as a within pathway 1, all of this will take place, right, within the T1 and L2 region. So let's just highlight that. So all of this will take place within the T1 to L2 region and support those regions with nerves for delivering sympathetic information. So the fight or flight response in those areas. Um, and yeah, so a common thing to just understand, the gray ramus is found pretty much everywhere in the body. The white ramus is only specific to the T1 and L2 regions. And this is because, well, this is where the sympathetics are needed the most because in terms of preganglionics, I apologize. And essentially, by having myelin, you get that information into the synaptic trunk much more quicker. All right, next pathway. So we have a second pathway, like, obviously here we see that sympathetic information is being transported out of T1 and L2 into the T1 and L2 regions. But if you want to travel into other regions, so above T1 and below L2 within the spinal cord and body overall, you'll need a second pathway. So essentially what happens is, this one's a little bit more simpler, you'll have another gray ramus. Okay, so let's just have this over here. And same thing over here, synapse happens, and now you have a new set of postganglionic axons. So I'll just put that down. And within that, you will now have a new spinal nerve. And the same principle applies here. You'll have your dorsal ramus go out, and then your ventral one shortly after, right around. The same, doing the exact same thing. So this specifically is for areas that are not within, let's not do that. This will specifically be for areas that are above T2, below L1, L2, sorry, and this would be T1. And the reason this is so important is because in this pathway we see that it goes back into T2, T1 and L2, but this one's just outside, so keep that in mind. There is no white ramus here because as said previously, white ramus only exists in T1 to L2. So that's pathway 2. All right. Okay, so now we have two overall pathways covered. The first one being the T1 to L2 lumbar arc region, not lumbar arc, spinal regions, and then the spinal nerves not in the T1 and L2 region, right? So now, what about organs, right? So obviously we may know that there are organs associated with the sympathetic nervous system, some being the intestines and the others being like the adrenal medulla. So what happens now? There'll be a third pathway. And this third pathway will have what we call a splenic nerve. And what that does is that essentially transports, key thing over here, preganglionic, apologize. Preganglionic, that's key, out of the synaptic trunk. So remember how synapses occur over here, leading to postganglionic axons on both sides of this synapse? Here, no synapse occurs. So instead, we have presynaptics, preganglionics, preganglionic. And let me make this clear. Synapse. So preganglionic to post. And essentially, from the splenic nerve, you'll eventually enter this one structure called the prevertebral ganglion. And essentially, the reason it's there is you're basically doing the whole synapse thing here. So synapse occurs, synapse, and now you have your postganglionic, and that essentially will travel to your organs through blood vessels and all that stuff. So it kind of goes along with those. These organs will be like the intestines, adrenal medulla, so they'll be in like regions like the thorax, pelvis, and abdomen. So overall, this is like the overall idea of the sympathetic nervous system pathway, specifically within the autonomic nervous system. And hopefully this video helped a little bit. I apologize that I'm kind of stopping every now and then, but it's because I'm just trying to write things out as if you were to draw it too. Thanks.